Hi there, my name is Alex Johansson, and this is going to be a talk on approachable design and my kind of appeal to you to consider it. So a little bit about my background. I'm an experimental games designer from Sheffield in the north of England. I've been building games for over a decade now at this point, in lots of different forms. Released around 7 commercial titles, and then built a bunch of like unusual installations that I've kind of like toured around the world. So stuff like, you know, this Morse code controller that's operated with a telegraph key, or like this setup here, which is a game called Vaccination, where you're like injecting medicine into a patient, which was developed pre-pandemic. That I kind of took around America and Europe as well. And you know, my particular interest and focus has been around approachable design, and building these weird interfaces to try and like captivate and engage a wider audience. I'm also an educator, but was a lecturer for a number of years, and generally I'm really passionate about education and like empowering people to like engage with the tools that we use to build these kinds of experiences. So to jump straight in to kind of one of my main points as part of this presentation is that the games industry is going through a really rough patch right now, arguably like a collapse, and along with like interest rates, one of the driving factors behind that collapse and the reason that it's so high risk to get funding and invest in games right now is because of the audience. We are really dependent on an audience that has standards that are far too high for us to be able to sustain. You know, there's kind of the common refrain about gamers having more games in their library than they actually play. You know, outnumbering the actual played games by a significant amount. And yeah, what gamers require of games nowadays are just becoming more and more hard work. So, you know, needing to make experiences that are 4 or 5 hours long at the very least, and then like maintaining and updating experiences, you know, into the foreseeable future. And you know, unfortunately, one of the side effects of having an audience that is spoilt for choice, in the form of, you know, having literally, as you can see here, like 14,000 games released a year just for one platform, is that they can often become quite entitled in terms of what they expect from their games. And, you know, in extreme cases that can lead into some real toxic behavior. But all in all, it's just a real inefficient use of time that there are like thousands of games going unplayed and unrecognized. And then you contrast that against, there must be at least 1 billion people that have never played a game before in the world. A digital commercial game, at least. And of that number, there's probably billions that exist out there that have never been directly catered for within that. You know, I'll go into some of those audiences in a moment. In my case, I've decided to kind of make that leap and try and pursue new audiences for games. I spent a lengthy amount of time building experiences for commercial audiences, but that's always been balanced with designing unusual interfaces to house them and to try and like engage with new audiences. And that's always been framed in building experiences for public settings. And in the last year or so, I've tried to distance myself from gaming because I've just kind of reached the, like, even, you know, well ahead of when things started to really fall apart. I'd kind of recognized that like it just wasn't sustainable to try and cater to audiences with even remotely experimental projects, and that by catering to audiences beyond games, like I was able to bring the scope down. And that's what I've done with Glow Golf, which is this LED project that I've built where the whole game's played along a single LED strip. And in the case of Glow Golf, you've got, you know, your green for the grass, the yellow for the sand, the blue for the water, and then the kind of the white for the ball and the black for the hole. And you know, you pull this controller and release it like a pinball, this controller in fact, and you launch it, and that propels the the ball along a track. And yeah, like that's worked as a really lovely format. I've exhibited it in a bunch of different settings, and my particular interest with this isn't to engage conventional gamers. It's to get it into things like care homes, like residential homes, and what I'm currently doing is exhibiting it in spaces for young people with disabilities and facilitating workshops around that. So, like, why should you, as games developers, consider new audiences? And when there is already this pre-established market. So obviously, I've mentioned that like there's this high level of saturation that exists, where it costs silly amounts of money to not only build an experience up to standard, but then to cut through to reach them. It's just really you're really up against it, and yeah, like the thing that's great about working with new audiences is that like the expectations of what games should be is like zero. Like the bar is so much lower for like where games need to be at to be engaging for them if you're catering it directly to them. And if you look at something like the elderly, like having someone come into a care home and sing for them or do a workshop with them is they're so grateful for that. So like the idea of building games experiences for them directly is just like it's next level, and that just brings the budget, the time scale, and the scope way down for those experiences, but you still get to design stuff that is compelling design-wise and interesting. And in this way, you're competing in a smaller pool, and you're not competing against machines that are built for extraction, which is like the state of a lot of studios now and a lot of publishers. And yeah, that's just a lot more dignified for you as a developer, and it's also less dehumanizing for the audience. And what's nice as well about developing for these audiences is that it helps you to challenge your own biases. So, for example, we take a lot of things for granted that people understand in the form of games, in the form of players, that aren't actually really intuitive. The great example of that is the kind of games joypad and stuff. Like analog sticks are not an intuitive interface. They are for gamers, but if you hand that to someone who's never played games before, they're just not going to get it. So you get that insight of like what works and what doesn't. And then what on the other side of things, you've also got the element that like, because they have no point of reference of what games should be, it means that they are a lot more innovative in like going beyond genres that exist and challenging expectations of what games should be. So why the elderly? Why have I considered this audience specifically? So for me, like the thing that I find most compelling about the elderly is that like they are a group that is like primed and perfect for engaging with games. Like for the in particularly people who are in like residential residential homes or care homes, like they are deprived of agency, stimulation, and often isolated, and things like play and the escapism that comes with gaming is used in teenage when you're a teenager to kind of like alleviate anguish and things like that, and like and create purpose and things like that. The same could be used at the the other end of life. And yeah, I don't know. Like it just seems ridiculous that they've not been considered in that regard. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that like the industry has this stigma around the elderly, where it's perceived as a medium that belongs to the young, and that's just not true anymore. Like there's developers that are dying of old age at this point, and in the next 20 years, people that grew up with arcades will be in their 80s and 90s, and the people that grew up with the Wii will be in the 40s and 50s. So like it's gonna skew older, like it's inevitable, and as part of that, like we're gonna need to facilitate for those audiences when they reach that age, but we can also start now. There's no reason that we have to wait 20 years from now to start considering these audiences, particularly ones who've never had the privilege of like playing games as a medium. But the thing is like there's already been proof that they can be engaged with the audience. Like the example existed 20 years ago was the Wii Sports. That game was like marketed explicitly to the elderly as like a valid audience. And there was a lot of things, I don't have time to go into it, but there was a lot of things that they did as part of that game to make them feel welcome and facilitated within it. You know, just to mention a few things like motion controls, like the fact that you were basically doing charades for input, the fact that the actual controller looked like a remote, which is one of the most familiar technological interfaces that a lot of elderly people have. And yeah, I said they were included within the marketing, and like having that representation meant that there was a high uptick of these platforms being installed in care homes. And in the very sweet example last year, Jeannie, who was 96, and Gilbert, who was 85, won a Wii bowling tournament in France, which is incredible. That's far more investment than what most gamers would do, but it's a true indicator that like they can be engaged. So like in terms of like what I'm exploring, I'm just going to move myself over here. Oops, nope, not. Bear with me a second. So in terms of what I'm looking to explore, I want to use the medium of LEDs, which is like this really minimalist format, to kind of express as much as I can and make these kind of playful physical interactions for people to experience. And again, keeping the budget low by keeping the constraints really rigid. So things like designing experiences just for an LED strip, using a single input, which is a spring-loaded pinball launcher, and then pairing that with like playful things like, for example, having printables. So like when you've like cast out your line for this fishing game and you draw in a fish, it'll like print it out, and then you'll have like a catch that you can kind of compare with some of the other people in the communal space that you share. And like that, the communal element is something that I'm really passionate about. Like rather than the kind of like individualistic format of games currently where everyone has a console and everyone plays individually, I want these to be grounded in communal spaces, with like shared games experiences. So like in the case of a pond, you'll have the same fish at different times of the day that will be catchable. So what I hope in theory is that like you'll get like these like receipt printings like shared on like a scoreboard or like a catch board. And yeah, like as part of that, I want to try and predominantly run this in like physical spaces, so things like exhibitions, and also to do workshops to try and like surface what I'm kind of coining as universal interfaces. So that format for kind of like identifying universal interfaces is like focused around like grassroots kind of hands-on workshops, working with marginalized groups. So and with that, like the easiest way to get people to show you what interfaces resonate with them is to use like the mediums that we're all familiar with, and one of those is craft. So craft is really good because like everyone from a young age to old knows how to make things with cardboard and tinfoil and tape and things like that, and that serves because there's like the barrier for entry is super low. Technically it's just all creative expression, and through that you can kind of really nail down like what interfaces resonate with people in a way that isn't intimidating or condescending. So like this interface you can see to the right hand side here, where you've got like these characters running along the screen and they're kind of back and forth motion, that was designed by this lady here in the pink shawl, and for her that motion was really intuitive to her because of, when I asked her, because of scratch cards. That interface was what she was familiar with, what she associated that motion with. And what was a real light bulb moment for me was the idea that like that interface could be used to reach other people within her demographic. And then like if that resonated with, you know, other older women, like could you then design experiences for them within the constraints of that interface? And yeah, it's just a really organic way of identifying these interfaces. So like, just to give another example, like this controller here with the door slam, like doors exist basically everywhere on Earth. The way this interface worked is that you kind of slammed the door shut and then that launched the kind of golf ball along the track. And the idea that like doors exist anywhere on Earth and everyone knows how to operate doors makes it a universal interface. Like you could technically design an experience for anywhere in the world, and if you use the door as like a control mechanism for it, you know, similar to things like taps or steering wheels, you can really democratize that, like that input. I do want to kind of stop and kind of a bit of a reality check that like this has all been really interesting research that I've done, but there's a habit with a lot of talks that people do where they like present all this stuff and kind of lay out this golden road of like routes that you could take. I will say now that I have been doing this for like around, like specifically around like running workshops and exhibitions and stuff for around 6 to 8 months, and like it is just about sustainable at this point for me. That is someone with like over 10 years of experience in all of these areas, and you know, with support. So like I'm not going to pretend that this is commercially sustainable right now, but having said that, neither is the industry. Like things are not commercially sustainable right now, and you know, like it's just one of these things of like, if that's the case, then you might as well try to do something good with it and try and reach new audiences. So in terms of like reasons for kind of optimism and kind of indications that like some of these things that I've discussed are kind of coming to fruition. An example from the industry right now is Special Effect, which is an organization that builds bespoke interfaces for people with disabilities, particularly children, and helps them to kind of keep engaging with games, and yeah, like designs them kind of bespoke inputs. And that's incredible work. That's then also had this knock-on effect of affecting, you know, platforms such as Microsoft and Sony to like build their own adaptive controllers like this thing here. And that's great. You know, the thing that's also really positive is that like off the back of that, Special Effect also made some frameworks which like showed developers how to make their games more accessible to people with disabilities. And what's great is that like a lot of the disabilities that they've kind of provided support for and suggestions also overlap with a lot of the disabilities that come with older age. So there is a very tangible likelihood that that they will be adopted into that framework at some point. But having said that, in both cases, I think that like this is making people with disabilities and the elderly compatible with commercial gaming. And what needs to happen next is that like rather than trying to conform those people to the market needs to cater for them. And you know, people need to consider them as a legitimate audience and stop trying to make kind of like make that, you know, them compatible with the existing markets and audience. People need to take a risk and take a chance on building experiences for them directly. And in terms of where to start yourselves, the crucial thing I'll say is keep the scope small. Like that's probably the biggest thing I can emphasize. It's the reason I went for LED strips, because like it keeps the cost down. A lot of research and projects that are built for the elderly and other marginalized audience tend to be built using the format, tools and terms of the industry, and it just tends to make things like one-off projects. It's very, very hard to build those things at scale to the standards of the industry, and it's really inefficient because they don't need those standards. The other one that's really important is, which is really cheap to do, is ditch the keyboard and gamepad. Use like cheap hardware like the Makey to build interfaces that are intuitive to them, and if you can't figure it out, give them the tools through workshops to show you which interfaces are intuitive to them. Present them with your game and be like, how would you like to interact with this game? A way that you can do this yourself is to take a game that you've already built and try make an interface for it that works, that doesn't rely on keyboard, mouse, and this weird gamepad thing with 14 inputs that don't all correspond with each other. And then from that, once you've built that kind of approachable interface, try designing some experiences with that being the dominant focus. Like, try, like in my case, like try build games around like a pinball controller, and see what interesting interfaces you come up with. And the thing, more than anything else, if you take anything away from this, is just to, the next time you build a game, try to think of someone either in your life or an audience that is not considered by gaming or the industry. Try and think how you can just reach one person, one new person completely disconnected from games. Think about how you can integrate them into your project and make them feel welcome, and to make your project more approachable to them. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to be running a workshop after this where I'm going to have Glow Golf set up in the space, and then you're welcome to come over and make some controllers for the game yourselves. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me, Alex Johansson at hotmail.co.uk. Thanks.